So we've been in this book before, but I cannot stress just how good this book has actually been in the past couple of days, and a lot of this done by Ian Dunnett a lot of it has been looking at potential scenarios that could happen and outlining just how unprepared we are to go into negotiations and actually deal with a lot of this stuff, because a lot of it was not talked about during the lead up to Brexit. Now, I'm going to read what is essentially the last chapter, and if you are not wetting yourself after this, then you should be, because if anything, from what has been going on in the last couple of days about ministers undercutting workers' rights, as many other things that we have got gained from the EU, well, I'm glad. Unfortunately, this isn't a good outlook for you. So, yeah, this is essentially the final chapter. What happens after Brexit? The real threat from a hard Brexit is not about economic calamity or a chaotic retreat to the World Trade Organization. The real threat will not be felt for years. It lies like a ticking bomb in the Great Repeal Bill. Once Britain has left the single market and started trading on WTO rules, it will be able to start looking for countries to sign trade deals with, and it has its eyes set on the US, China, Japan, Australia and India. Once it does so, two key factors will combine dangerously. On one hand, Britain will be economically and politically desperate for a deal after a torrid and hard Brexit. On the other, it will have as much of its body of law and in a state of uncertainty. British legal standards will be virtually at a precise oh dear. Sorry, let's start again there. British legal standards will be virtually precipitantly at the moment they come under intense pressure. A parliamentary device will likely be used in the Great Repeal Bill to disentangle the vines of the EU and UK law in its statutory instrument. Deploying one allows ministers to change the law without having to pass a whole new act through Parliament, which is what a lot of people are worried about at the moment. Statutory instruments are supposed to be used for uncontroversial updates to legislation, little administrative tasks like legally recognising a new type of speed camera or altering the designation of a rural primary school. But increasingly, they are being used to push through controversial changes. Towards the end of 2014, the government used one to ban certain kinds of pornography from video on demand and tried unsuccessfully to make changes to the electoral registration system that angered transgender people. According to Downing Street, statutory instruments in the Great Repeal Bill would give the government the flexibility to take account of the negotiations with the EU as they proceed. In one sense, this is reasonable. Exiting the European Union is complicated. It would be difficult to achieve without statutory instruments. But it's also incredibly dangerous. Ministers would have the power to tinker with nearly half a century of law and industrial standards. Everything is there from British environmental policy to employment rights to consumer protections. There will be no European law to stop ministers, and no bill will be justified on the floor of the House of Commons or in a TV studio. On a rainy Friday afternoon, ministers will be able to make bits of law vanish. The government has promised it will not do so, or rather, in a bid to placate Labour MPs, they have promised that they will not do this specifically in the area of workers' rights. To those who are trying to frighten British workers, saying when we leave, employment rights will not be eroded, I firmly and unequivocally "No, they won't," David Davis said upon the announcement of the bill. But then that is all that has been offered. Promises from ministers about powers they have given themselves are not worth the paper they are written on. So there have been no announcements of parliamentary safeguards for repealing of laws. Davis has not announced a committee, say where MPs and peers assess the laws which are jettisoned. In fact, he has been desperate to avoid any parliamentary scrutiny from the process at all. He has refused to publish a green paper, a command paper, or a sectorial economic impact assessment, despite his promises. The approach of the May government to Brexit has been one of absolute secrecy and total lack of scrutiny. This is further cause for concern. Once out of the EU, Britain will seek trade deals with large countries whom we will be the junior partner economically. We may need to turn things around urgently after the shock imposition of tariff and non-tariff barriers. Politically, the government will be desperate to prove that it can, in the Prime Minister's words, make a success of this venture. So the UK will be put in a vulnerable position precisely when other nations start to opportunistically start demanding lower industrial standards. Pharmaceuticals will go first. That is the rule. In the US trade negotiations, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most influential around. American pharma giants have incredibly powerful and well-established lobbying operation. Trade deals have been put in danger of collapse in Congress because they did not like them. Their appearance is a precondition for a successful US trade negotiation. The industry has long looked at the NHS with undisguised appetite. Contrary to left-wing conspiracy theories, the pharmaceutical industry does not hate the NHS. It does not care where the money comes from. What it hates is NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. NICE compares quality and price, which is a disaster for the drug industry. The US pharmaceutical firms are likely to demand the abolition or at least the reform of NICE. As a consequence, drug prices will rise. The full effects will only be felt years later. But a decade on, say, the health services already precarious as finance will come intolerable under the strain from extra costs. This will not be blamed on Brexit, but then there will appear a permanent but then there will be presumably another government and another opposition, and it will not be in their interest to pin the blame on the events from 15 or 20 years ago. The opposition will blame the government for the day because that is what oppositions do, and the government will blame anyone but the government of the day because that is what governments do. But the cause of that crisis will be Brexit. Silicon Valley also exerts a huge interest in US trade deals. American tech firms are increasingly outraged by the EU's data protection rules, not least the controversial right to be forgotten. When Google launched a failed action in early 2016, firms are also being asked by the EU to specify how they used people's data. Automatically allow people to migrate their data to new providers, information and governments of data breaches, and demonstrate how they are protecting private data. If they fail, they can be fined 4% of their global revenue. Silicon Valley will be seeking to avoid this. US negotiators will demand that the UK reduces its data protection standards from an EU to a US level. So that means our data is going to be even more vulnerable. The same pressure will be applied across all industries. Take REACH, the European regulation on registration, evaluation, authorization, and regulation and restriction of chemicals. Its guiding principle is that there is a lack of evidence about the safety of a chemical. It cannot be used until it can be shown to be safe. The American system has the opposite approach. Where there is no evidence to demonstrate harm, the chemical is allowed, until proven otherwise. US negotiators will push for the UK to adopt the American standard. In some cases, standards may be protected by our deal with Europe. EU leaders are not going to accept untested chemicals into their market, so Britain will either have to reject US request and risk the deal, or carve out sectors of its economy where it is producing, importing and exporting different standards. In any area where British standards are currently higher than European ones, for instance on drug quality and price assurance, they are likely to be lowered. In other treaty talks, there will be much about reducing standards and as accepting the required policy for negotiating government. In negotiation with India, for instance, immigration is likely to feature. Indian students often find it hard to come to the UK, and that has not become any easier since May's crackdown on student visas. Despite all the talk of cutting immigration, UK negotiators will come under strain to make concessions to Indian requests in return for a trade deal. With China, the concern will be energy security. Beijing is likely to demand a greater role in the provision of our energy infrastructure. May's decision to authorise the Hillary Point C nuclear power plant, where the Chinese committed 1/3 of the 18 billion cost, gave them a foothold in Western Europe, as well as a stake in a new project at Siswell, and possibly the building of its own reactors at Bradwell and Essex. China will petition for more access to the market. This is the reality of trade talks. Sovereignty will be bartered for commerce. Brexiteers will tell you that this is different to the EU because voters can always kick out the government that conducted negotiations to repeal any deal it made. In reality, this never happens. Once a trade deal is signed, it is almost impossible to reverse. That sovereignty stays sold. The real distinction between the EU trade talks is that at the EU you can usually watch the talks and which lead to political decisions. Trade deals are held behind closed doors. Britain is about to experience a toxic mix of weak law and strong lobbying. It is tantamount to switching off a country off and on again, except that it will not revert to its original state. It will revert, in all likelihood, to a low-tax, low-regulation, laissez-faire economy more akin to that of Singapore or Hong Kong than the countries on the continent. The idea that Britain has grown stronger by leaving the EU will be seen as a bad joke when it is being bounced from pillar to pillar and post to post by bigger negotiating partners. Any negotiation that control has seen being taken back will seem cruel and absurd. Sovereignty will pass from Brussels over the heads of the British people into the closed negotiating rooms of Washington, Beijing and New Delhi. So, not only was this book written, it came out a couple of months ago. Already in that chapter it has pretty much predicted one thing that we know is going to happen. We are looking at an erosion of workers' rights and as well as other things, not to mention those when it comes to negotiations, and the erosion of NICE, a drug company that makes sure that the drugs we are buying are nice and that they are affordable. The fact that we might lose that and increase, the burden on the NHS is quite frankly terrifying. So, to anyone who voted for Brexit, after hearing that chapter, are you still confident that Brexit is good for us and good for the country? I didn't think it was before. After reading this, I certainly still do not think, even more so, that it is a good idea. Anyone else would like to, challenge me? If anyone can think of a good sort of pro-Brexit book, I will be more than happy to get that and read that and see what it's like compared to this. But, oh boy. I am not looking forward to this at all. It's not going to be good, people. It really isn't. And I'm sorry to break it to you. There need to be a lot of hard truths talked to people. And the problem is it's not being done. You know, if you are pro or anti-Brexit, I recommend this book to you. Brexit, What the Hell Happens Now? Buy it, read it, and be shocked to your core. Because I am.